One of the most dramatic moments in the Cold War came during Ronald Reagan's second term, when he met with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev to negotiate an arms control agreement. At the time, they were thinking of negotiating about defensive systems. Ronald Reagan had proposed something called the Strategic Defense Initiative. And this was going to be an American defensive system that, if actually built, would potentially shoot down incoming Russian Soviet offensive missiles. This was what sort of got the negotiating ball rolling. But when they met in Reykjavik, Iceland, they began talking about a bigger agenda. And what came out on the table was the possibility of eliminating whole systems of offensive nuclear weapons. The defensive systems, by and large, hadn't been built yet. So this was just foregoing something that didn't exist. But the idea of eliminating or substantially reducing existing systems, this was a big deal. And over the course of a weekend, Reagan and Gorbachev began talking about their longer-term goals, their hopes for their countries, their hopes for humanity. And Reagan even laid out to Gorbachev his vision of a world beyond nuclear weapons. And he proposed that the two sides eliminate all nuclear weapons. So if this had been accepted by Gorbachev, then the world might go beyond the nuclear age. The nuclear age began in 1945, and ever since then, humanity had lived under this nuclear shadow, the possibility that there could be a devastating nuclear war that might kill hundreds of millions, perhaps even billions of people, destroy the planet even to some substantial degree, take the world back to the Stone Age in a sense. And Reagan and Gorbachev were talking about this possibility. Now, I wrote a book about Ronald Reagan. I wrote a biography of Ronald Reagan. And I've been at this history game long enough to be skeptical about this kind of thing and say, wait a minute, would this really happen? But I have to say that in reading the records of the conversation between Gorbachev and Reagan, I kind of got swept up in the moment. And I think the two of them got swept up in the moment. And it was though each one was trying to outbid the other. This is what I can do for humanity. And it looked as though the world came within, just a small space of actually getting out from under this nuclear nightmare. This has been the dream of countless people ever since the Cold War began. And it looked at that moment, on that weekend in Iceland, that maybe it was going to happen. Now, it didn't happen. In fact, Gorbachev and Reagan couldn't come to an agreement on a particular aspect of the proposed American defensive system, SDI. Should it be tested simply in the laboratory or should it be field tested? And they couldn't come to an agreement. And even if they had come to an agreement, it was debatable, to say the least, whether they could have brought their governments along. There were lots of skeptics on the American side that Reagan was going to give too much away to the Soviet Union. There were skeptics on the Soviet side that Gorbachev was going to agree to too much. And so it's not inevitable. It wasn't inarguable that just because Gorbachev and Reagan had come to this agreement, had they come to the agreement, that it would have actually changed history. But it does give rise to an old question about how history happens. What is history? What moves history? If you want to describe the dynamics of history, what do you look at? One of my fields of sort of specialization in history is presidential history. And as the name suggests, you study presidents. And it is often held in relatively low esteem by professional historians, people who are professors at universities, because it's seen as an old-fashioned way of looking at things, very passé. And it's often dismissed as just another version of that great man theory of history. This is the term for it. And there was a time, in fact, when this great man theory of history was respected and people took it seriously. When the term is used these days, it's usually as a way of saying, this guy just isn't cutting edge, and nobody pays any attention to that great man theory stuff anymore. Whether it's fashionable or not, it's worth looking at because it gets at this question of, so what is it that makes up history? How does history move? If you want to explain how things happen, who do you look at? Presumably you look at people, because history is the story of people. If you want to look at the story of rocks, you study geology. You get the idea. Anyway, so there was a time, as I say, when the great man theory was taken seriously, and just because it's dismissed these days doesn't mean it's wrong. Things come in and out of fashion, and just what we believe today is not necessarily what's right. If people believe something else in the past, that might be right. So let's look at it for a moment. And I've got some observations on this because as I say, I get sort of accused of this sometimes, but also because it reflects on what we know about history, how we can tell history. So the first question is, if you're talking about a great man theory of history, what's this history you're talking about? And I'll say this, that history, that kind of history, the history that's referred to in discussions great man theory, it's a particular kind of history. It's the history of public affairs. It's what sometimes I call big history. It's the history of big events, wars and elections and the movements of armies and peoples and the creations of nations and revolutions and all of this. It's the kind of history, that you'd read about in the first draft on the front page of newspapers. So what did the president do today, and what did Congress do today? And it includes, what did great artists or great inventors or great authors do? What do prominent people do? Because when you talk about great man theory, and these days, anybody who endorses this idea would say great man, great woman theory of history, and even in the old days. I should add, one of the reasons that it's dismissed is that it's always looking at great men in the past, and where are the women? And the answer is that the great man theory of history includes people like Queen Victoria and Queen Elizabeth of England and Catherine the Great of Russia. The fact is, though, that when we're talking about matters of public affairs, when we're talking about the actions of governments, it is true that mostly the positions of influence in governments have been held by men. And so it tends to be sort of great guy theory and not great women. But it has to do more with the emphasis of, so who are the actors in history you're looking at? So if you do want to look at, say, what's happening in the government of the United States or in American political culture, you're going to be kind of driven toward this great man theory. Years ago, 25 years ago, I decided I wanted to write a 6-volume history of the United States. And I pitched the idea to publishers. And they said, nobody wants to read that much history. 6 volumes, you kidding me? Nobody would read that much. Nobody would buy the books. And I initially, I was a little bit discouraged by this response, but I thought, first of all, I think American history is a great story, and it's a big story, and it can be told in lots of volumes. It doesn't have to be just in one volume. You could spread it out over 6 volumes. And so I decided that I was going to write this history anyway, but I was going to do it in the form of biographies. Because biographies, a lot of people have a dubious view of history. They remember their high school history class, and they thought I was boring, and they don't want to learn any more history. But biographies, these are stories of people's lives, and there's a magazine called People. People are interested in people and celebrities and all this stuff, so So I was going to do it through biographies. And initially, I did not have in mind that my biographies were going to be mostly presidents. It turned out, though, that there were 6 volumes in this series, and 5 of them were presidents. And the first one, wasn't a president because there wasn't a United States to be president of. The first volume was about Benjamin Franklin, who died just the year after George Washington became the first president of the United States. But then the subsequent volumes are about Andrew Jackson, who was a soldier and president, Ulysses Grant, soldier and president, Theodore Roosevelt, kind of soldier and conservationist and writer and president, Franklin Roosevelt, president, Ronald Reagan, actor, not a great actor, but then president. So they all turned out to be presidents. Why did they turn out to be presidents? All 5 of the 6 turned out to be presidents. Why? Because I wanted to tell the story of the evolution of the United States and of America. And I wanted to hang the story on an individual. And there's no better individual, or maybe I should say there's no more convenient individual to hang the story of a particular era on than a particular president of that era. Because presidents are smack in the middle of those public affairs, of that kind of history that I mentioned when I was talking about great man view of history. So if the history you want to learn about is the history of war and peace and stuff like that, then it's going to focus, I won't say it's necessarily going to focus on individuals, but individuals are going to play a large role because it's individuals who make those decisions. And if I had wanted to write an economic history, in fact, there was another time when I did write an economic history of the United States, this in just 1 volume, and I also focused on individuals again. So I focused on inventors like Thomas Edison and Henry Ford, but also businessmen like John Rockefeller and sort of businessmen and techies like Bill Gates and Oprah Winfrey and Liz Claiborne and various people like this. But again, I focused on people. And one of the reasons I focused on people was, again, not because from a philosophical standpoint, in every case I agree with this great man version of history. By the way, the epitome of this version was something that's said by Thomas Carlyle, an English historian of the 18th century, and he says that history is nothing more than the biography of great men. So his focus is on individuals. Look at these great men, look at Napoleon, Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, and so on. Learn about those people and you'll learn all there is to know of interest about history. I don't agree that you'll learn all there is to know, but I would say that you'd get a good head start on knowing stuff. So one of the reasons for focusing on individuals is that there are moments, there are areas of history where individuals really do matter. There's probably no better instance of this than Abraham Lincoln's presidency. In particular, Abraham Lincoln's decision to resist Southern secession. When 7 states of the South seceded following Lincoln's election in 1860, Lincoln was faced with a choice. Do you let them go? Maybe saying, tut, tut, tut. Conceivably, he could have said, good riddance. Or do you resist secession? And if Lincoln had said, nope, let them go, I think they're wrong, I think it's unconstitutional, but it's not worth a war, or I don't have the authority to start a war, then there would not have been a civil war. Because the President of the United States at that moment in that position was the one who was going to make a decision for war or peace. And Lincoln chose war. He chose military resistance against secession. So that's a case where if you want to know why American history, I don't say the American public history, the history of the United States as a political entity, why it took this turn rather than that turn, focus on Lincoln. That's where you're going to get the answer. And that is probably the best example of the role of, well, I'll call him the great man. And by the way, I should say here that great man doesn't necessarily mean great and good. You can think that Abraham Lincoln was the devil incarnate the way a lot of people in the South did, including John Wilkes Booth, who assassinated him. But great in the sense of having this great influence or a big influence. So Adolf Hitler was a great man under this definition because he had a great effect on the world around him. Nobody would say he's a good man. He's a horrible man. But nonetheless, he falls in this category of the people who have a great impact on their world. Anyhow, so that's an example of something that really lends itself to this particular version, this particular theory of history. There are other aspects of history that don't lend themselves quite that well. So if you look at something like the Industrial Revolution, the application of steam power to manufacturing processes that started in the mid-1700s in Britain and spread to the United States and elsewhere around the world in the 1800s. This wasn't the work of any one individual. There are some individuals whose names are associated with it. James Watt is often given credit for inventing the steam engine, but he didn't invent the steam engine entirely. Steam had been used to provide mechanical power going back to the days of the ancient Greeks. He had a particular kind of steam engine that worked pretty well, just as Thomas Edison Well, he's given credit for the light bulb, and people had discovered that you could make light using electricity, but Edison was one who came up with a bulb that actually lasted for a while and so made commercial sense. But the Industrial Revolution is something that is not explained in terms of individuals. There were thousands of inventors who were involved in the Industrial Revolution. If you want to explain the Industrial Revolution, you have to come to terms with all of these people. I mean, not all of them, but you have to come to terms with lots of them. And so it isn't the kind of thing that lends itself to this particular decision at this particular moment, the way Lincoln's decision to resist secession did and does. There are other kinds of history that really even go beyond that. So in the case of, I mentioned I wrote this book about American economic history, and I looked at 25 great entrepreneurs, as I call them. The book is called Masters of Enterprise, and the noun version of, or the individual version of enterprise is entrepreneur, the enterpriser, comes from French. And I looked at these individuals, and I didn't claim by any means that they were responsible for all that happened, but they do get you down that road. And for the same reason that I decided to write my American history in the form of biographies, I chose to focus on individuals. And here's why. And this is where it gets to not just what it is you're trying to explain, but the way you're trying to explain it. And that is that I could have written a history of the development of, let's say, electrical generation systems. And I could discuss technical details and the battle between alternating current and direct current and how it was going to be controlled. Was it a public utility or a private enterprise, or what was it? And I could write something like that that would be really dry, and it would be hard to get people engaged in. Now, for somebody who is already interested in the subject, who wants to get in the nuts and bolts of things, well, that's fine. It's a little bit like if you are an auto mechanic, you want to fix cars, and you're really interested in cars. If you can get your hands on a manual of how to take apart this particular engine, you don't care, you don't want a plot, you don't want interesting dialogue, you don't want anything like that, you just want the information. And so if you have a pre-existing interest in this subject, maybe what you want is just the basic information. Forget about making it interesting. In fact, making it interesting might just be a waste of your time because it's more stuff you have to read. Just give me the bullet points. But for most people, they're not that interested in, okay, so what were the specifications of Nikola Tesla's electrical generation systems and of Thomas Edison's, and how did they differ and how was one better than the other? No, they want to know sort of how people are involved. People respond to people. Why is it that novels, almost always, there are probably a couple of exceptions, they have a protagonist. There is some main character. There might be 2 main characters, 3 main characters, but novels are about people. They put people front and center. Why is it that movies are that way? Because people respond to people. So I decided to write biographies as a way of telling history because it's easier to engage interest in, well, what was Andrew Jackson up to? Whether you liked what Andrew Jackson was up to or whether you didn't like what he was up to. At least we're talking about an individual. Individuals in history speak in the sense that, well, when I wrote my biographies, I wrote about people who left behind letters. So I could resurrect their voices, not their literally audio voices, but at least their words were on the page. When Benjamin Franklin wrote that nothing is more certain in life than death and taxes, he really did say that. More precisely, he really did write it in a letter. And you get a sense of what's going on in the heads of your characters because they have these voices, or at least with the ear's imagination, they speak. They have voices. In a way, you can't recapture the voices exactly of lots and lots of people. It's just a cacophony of sound. This is also one of the reasons when people write about American political history, they tend to write about presidents rather than about Congress. They could write about Congress, but the thing is, when you write about Congress, you're writing about, well, nowadays there are 535 members of Congress. And how can you write about 535 people? It's too unwieldy. Whereas when you focus on the president, then you can tell a story about the president. And telling stories is an important part of conveying history. Now, there's another aspect of this. So the critics of me and of others who dismiss the great man theory of history and will leave aside the sort of great man or women, they don't like it because there aren't enough women. But part of it is it focuses on elites, important people. Well, yeah, but this is because elites or important people are the ones who make the big decisions. That's what makes them important. Andrew Jackson was not born a member of the elite, but he became president of the United States, and therefore he was in a position to make important decisions for the United States, for lots of people. If you want to know who has the largest influence on the most lives, you have to focus on the people who make the decisions. And that doesn't mean that they were born wealthy or elite, but they found themselves, or they placed themselves in positions where they would have this influence. So if you want to know sort of how the world works, what drives the world forward, then those are the ones you focus on. But there are other people who are not that interested in that. They want to know what life was like as lived. Okay, fair enough. And if people want to know what daily life was like, and that's certainly of interest, no question about that, then you focus on people who weren't important. You don't want to know what John D. Rockefeller's daily life was like, because it wasn't like the daily life of most people. What were the people who worked for John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company? What were their lives like? This is another reason that, well, there's this tendency to write about these important people, because you can write about these important people. It's a lot harder to write about the people who worked for John Rockefeller than it is to write about John Rockefeller. Why is this so? Because the people who worked for John Rockefeller were unimportant. Not unimportant to themselves, not unimportant to their loved ones, but unimportant to the world. Nobody else outside their families paid attention to them. This is important because people who ran into John Rockefeller on the street, they wrote in their diaries, "I met John Rockefeller today, and he really looked old and shriveled," or "he seemed happy for somebody who was that wealthy," or whatever they wrote. They paid attention. Whereas on the same day, they passed hundreds of people on the street that they didn't pay any attention to. For the historian can't work beyond the historian's records. Now, if you want to imagine what life was like at a particular time for which there are no records, fine, but you call it a novel. You don't call it a work of history. But if it's going to be a work of history, you have to have some records. What the historians call them are primary documents. These are materials that are like letters or diaries or journals or memoirs or recollections that are contemporary to the period you're talking about. They are produced by the participants in history or the eyewitnesses to history. It's not what somebody thought 100 years later. No, it's what somebody right there wrote down, said, and did. And if you're going to write about these people, if you're going to write about people this way, then you really almost always can find to write about these ones I'll call the great people. And they're great by virtue of the fact that people pay attention to them, or their greatness means that people pay attention to them. I wrote about Benjamin Franklin. And for Benjamin Franklin's first 20 years, the sources are really slim because Benjamin Franklin was a nobody. And nobody paid any attention to him. So Franklin's first 20 years, there's a collection of the edited and published papers of Benjamin Franklin. And it fills up a bookshelf about this long. They're up to about volume 35 or 6 now. And volume 1 is this thick, and it covers 20 years of Franklin's life. And the most recent volume is the same thickness, and it covers just 3 or 4 months of Franklin's life, because by then he was famous. And all sorts of people were writing to him, and he was writing to all sorts of people. And so people pay attention to somebody when they're famous. When you're not famous, nobody pays attention to you. So this presents a real hurdle to historians like me who are trying to write about ordinary life, what I sometimes call little history. Big history, again, history of war and peace and inventions and industrial revolutions. Little history, this is a history of private life, of what somebody said to somebody else in the privacy of their home. This is not unimportant. It's a part of the human past, so it's a part of history, but it's really hard to write about. And I know it's hard to write about because I've tried to write about it. And I've discovered that I have this principle for what you can say about history And it goes like this, that you can write about extraordinary people in ordinary times. So famous people. It doesn't matter if what's going on in the world is a really big deal or not. People pay attention to them. And so we know pretty much everything that Franklin Roosevelt did from the time he was born because he was born into a famous political family. And so he was I'll put him in these extraordinary category, just extraordinary, meaning out of the ordinary. And so people remembered what they saw about Franklin Roosevelt even when he was little, when he was a college student and so on. You can write about extraordinary individuals in ordinary times. The basic rules of history, you have to have contemporary records. You can write about extraordinary people in ordinary times, and you can write about ordinary people in extraordinary times. What do I mean by this? I've written books on the California Gold Rush and on the Civil War and a bunch of other things. But I'll use those two as examples. Because the people who went to California for the Gold Rush in 1849, 1850, these were very often quite ordinary people. But they just picked up and they went off to California. But I could write about them because they were living in extraordinary times. And even ordinary people, in extraordinary times, they do things they don't usually do. They kept diaries. They kept journals. They wrote letters home. And furthermore, the people who got the letters at home realized this is a big, important time of their lives. And so they saved the letters. But it's key that they were away from home because when you are living at home, you don't write a letter to your wife or your husband or your son or your daughter. You talk to them. But when you're away from them, that's the unusual thing. That's the extraordinary part of this. You write a letter. And so it's written and somebody can save it. So I could write about ordinary people during the extraordinary times of the California Gold Rush. Interestingly, I knew nothing about them or very little about them before they went off to California, before they started writing these letters or keeping the diaries. And when they were done in California, if they came back home, they often just fell off the radar screen of history. I don't know what happened to them. Because once again, they fell in the last category, ordinary people in ordinary times. It's really hard to write about ordinary people in ordinary times. Same thing is true in the Civil War. The Civil War was fought by mostly very ordinary people. But once they went off to war, whether they're Union soldiers or Confederate soldiers, they went off to the war and they knew that this was really a big deal. This was probably the biggest deal of their lives. And so they had time in camp and they wrote about it. They wrote letters home. And the loved ones at home who got the letters, they saved the letters. Because this is a big deal. This is going to be the most important thing in their lives. And so these ordinary people off in the armies, I can tell what they were doing because I can basically read their letters later on, which were preserved in the local historical society or in the Briscoe Center at the University of Texas or all sorts of historical archives and libraries. And I can read about them and I can write about them. But then they come home and they disappear. So extraordinary people in ordinary times, yeah, we can do that. Ordinary people in extraordinary times, we can do that. Ordinary people in ordinary times, that's hard. And this is one of the reasons that historians tend to gravitate toward that great man version of history. Call it again, great man and women, or just call it important if you want. And the history of ordinary life it's hard to get at. And when you get at it, you can talk about, for example, in American history, the number of air conditioners that were put in homes in the South. And okay, so you can get statistics, but in terms of putting an ordinary face on what it was like in that particular household, yeah, sometimes you can find somebody who wrote about it, was interviewed about it. But to carry that storyline through is really hard because you get snippets of ordinary life, but it's hard to write a biography, sort of birth to death account of someone who was entirely ordinary. And even for people who became important, I've written not exactly a biography of Geronimo, the Apache chief, but he's an important part of a book that I'm working on at the moment. And it's very hard to find anything about Geronimo's youth except what he himself includes in his memoir, because he's not keeping records, he's not writing letters to anybody, and so he really only appears on the screen of history toward the end of his life. And then there's a bunch of stuff. But that falls in the category, he's not yet famous, he's an ordinary person in ordinary times. So this is one of the things that sort of pushes historians in the direction, just as writers and as conveyors of these stories of history, toward focusing on these individuals. But it's important to remember that, well, we go back to the beginning. If Reagan and Gorbachev had agreed, boy, they would have been two of the most important individuals in history, but they still would have had to push their deal through their respective governments. And that broadens the frame a little bit. So there are moments when central figures are really central and they're decisive. In most cases, they're less than completely decisive, and in other cases, the cast of characters is just broader than that entirely. That's the way it goes.